Hello and welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5. I think everybody can see the slides on the screen and hear me. Looks like some people are still coming in, so we'll give it a few minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. If you have questions, you can type them in to the chat box at any time, but I won't be able to get to them until the end. Okay, so let's get started. So yeah, this is for Chapter 5, the discussion chapter. And what we will be covering today are the kind of general components of Chapter 5 or discussion, what's typically expected in the chapter. I do encourage everybody to, first thing to do before you start is get, obtain a copy of your school's template for the dissertation, specifically for the Chapter 5. Although there are a lot of commonalities, sometimes schools will have specifics that may differ from what's typically expected. And also professors, that gives them immediate reason for kind of sending your work back to you if you haven't followed whatever template the school has. So get the template if they have one, follow that. If they don't have a template, some schools don't. Like I said, this will be a general guide, which should work. And you can always ask your chair if the school doesn't have a template, if they have an example or something they prefer that you follow. Okay, let's see. All right, this is what we're going to cover. These are the basic components of the discussion chapter: introduction, interpretation of the findings, sometimes just called discussion itself, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, and sometimes a summary, not always needed. Okay. So introduction, just like any other chapter, the purpose of the introduction and the discussion section is to just kind of reorient the reader, about the study and kind of preview what's going to come up in the chapter. So it's always helpful to get started to restate the purpose of your study. And just kind of remind the reader of why you conducted your study, why it was necessary to conduct, why it was important, the need for your study. You can also preview the contents of the chapter if you want to. So again, just reorienting the reader about the purpose, the necessity of your study, why you conducted it, solid paragraph, maybe two at the most, and preview the sections that are going to come into in the chapter. Interpretations of the findings section, sometimes you call it discussion, which within the discussion chapter, but this is really the heart of the chapter. This is where you take your findings and you discuss them in relation to previous findings. And therefore, after that, you can make conclusions and you can make recommendations and you can make recommendations for practice, recommendations for further research. So people get kind of confused about this chapter. Sometimes they're not sure what to put in it and they just kind of copy and paste material for Chapter 4. So like I said, really what this is a discussion, and the big part of it is to to go back to major findings in chapter 2 to see how your findings support or don't relate the major findings from chapter 2. Okay, so a real reader-friendly and a writer-friendly way to structure the section is by your RQs. If it's quantitative, you have 3 RQs. You know, RQ1 asked, whatever RQ1 asked. Then restate your findings, summarize your finding for that research question, and then bring in major findings from chapter 2 from previous literature, and note whether your findings support those. Maybe they don't align, maybe they offer something new, and you want to set up a discussion based on that. If you're doing a qualitative study, organize a section by your themes. So have subsections for each theme. Theme number 1, here's what I found. Summarize the finding, and then pull major findings in from your chapter 2, your literature review, and set up a discussion, noting whether your findings support, don't support, or add something new. If your findings don't support previous research, if there's a difference, it's usually appropriate to explain why there might have been a difference. Sometimes it has to do with your population may be different. Sometimes it could have to do with your methodology is a little different than previous studies. But you need to offer some kind of explanation of why your findings may have been different from previous findings. Once you do that, you can set up these discussions. You can make conclusions based on your findings, right? So if your findings support previous findings, you can conclude something about that. If you say it's a quantitative study and you're trying to determine if 2 factors are related, a correlational study, and you find that they are, and that supports previous research, well, you can pretty safely conclude that, yeah, these factors are related, and your study confirmed that. If your study doesn't support previous research, the conclusion is that findings are still inconclusive, that there's still maybe more research needs to be done, or there's still unresolved issues. Okay, yeah, and let me go back to interpretation of the findings real quick. We talked about setting up for quantitative, setting it up for qualitative. Sometimes folks have mixed method studies. Similar kind of approach. Obviously, you want to hit both your quantitative findings and your qualitative findings. Usually what people do is hit the quantitative findings first, and then discuss the qualitative findings, noting where the qualitative findings may kind of support the quantitative information, or they may add something, and they may add details. And that's what the qualitative portion would be for in a mixed method study, partially, is to kind of add details and help explain the quantitative findings, add more details, more depth. So you would want 2 sections, and then probably have some kind of synthesis section where you kind of play the qualitative and the quantitative findings, relate them to one another. Okay, the limitations section, it's just like it sounds. I mean, it's a small discussion of the shortcomings or the weaknesses of your study that may have affected your results. Go back to chapters 1 or chapter 3. Sometimes you're required to write about potential limitations in the proposal, like what you foresaw, what you would foresee might have been weaknesses or limitations. So go back to those to see if those things that you thought might have been weaknesses actually ended up being weaknesses or limitations. So typical limitations, say for a quantitative study, would be low sample size. That's a big one because that affects the statistical certainty of your results. For qualitative, maybe you couldn't interview the people that you wanted to. You had to use a proxy population. So anything that may have like affected your results would be, listed and discussed in the limitations. And the idea is that when people are looking at your interpretations and your findings and you're making conclusions, if there's something that affected the results, it's a note to the reader that we have to kind of interpret these results with these limitations in mind. And it's also appropriate in the limitation section to discuss the generalizability of your findings to the larger target population. Usually quantitative studies with adequate or high sample sizes, the results tend to generalize well. For qualitative studies, generalization is always poor because of your low sample size, and it's kind of an accepted limitation of qualitative studies, but it's worth mentioning. So for example, you interviewed 10 people. That's a really low sample size, but it's necessary to get the kind of in-depth information that qualitative studies are designed for. So it's kind of, again, it's kind of an accepted limitation, but it's worth mentioning. Okay. Discuss how your findings inform practice. Yeah, implications for practice or recommendations for practice. And just a small side note here. I had somebody ask before, what's the difference between implications and recommendations? And I don't want to say it's all semantic, but there is a difference. Implications is, implications are consequences. So now that we have these results, now that we have these findings, what consequences does that have for practice? Okay, you can discuss that. But then at some point, they also want you to make recommendations. So the implications or recommendations are really closely tied together. And sometimes you don't need both. So implications for practice / recommendations for practice. This is, it's just like it sounds. So based on what you found, how can that inform what folks do at the level of practice in your area, right? So if it's about teaching, if it's say about, some you did a study for teachers on teachers. Now you have this information. Then what does it mean for them at the practice level? What does it mean for what they do in the classroom? What does it mean for maybe administrators? It could have something, it could have something to do with the choices that administrators make. And just think about if someone asked you, like a colleague or a friend, say, okay, now you did the study, you have these findings. What can you how does that relate to what you do at the ground level? Think about how you would talk to them. And this is a place you can get specific, right? I mean, it might lead to enhanced training or increased training. It might lead to seminars. It might lead to interventions. So real kind of nuts and bolts things at the level of practice. The other big section in the chapter is recommendations for further research. Again, this is kind of what your study is leading to. You can make conclusions, with some degree of certainty based on the research that you've done and how you've related it, seen what previous research has shown. You can make conclusions based on that. Then you can make, what does it mean for practice? What does it mean for further research? And recommendations should be based, again, on your specific findings. They're not general recommendations for research. They're not general recommendations for practice. They're based on what you found. And for recommendations for further research can also be based on your limitations. So for example, based on your findings, if your findings don't support previous research, that suggests inconclusiveness. So you can generally suggest more research on the topic. If your findings are new or novel or something, something unexpected came up, you definitely want to recommend more research on that to explore it further. Recommendations based on limitations would be recommending a similar study as yours, but just that researchers address what were limitations in your study, that they address those in their future studies. You can also recommend different types of studies to get different kinds of information. So if you, for example, conducted a correlational study, a quantitative study, and you found that two factors were related or connected, you could recommend more qualitative research to understand the nature of that relationship better. You could interview people about these topics or these factors. So different kinds of study, different designs to get different information. Case studies are good for exploring the topic more comprehensively because you have multiple sources of data. Things like longitudinal studies are designed to collect data over time, which adds a different element. So you can recommend different designs and different types of studies to obtain different information on the topic. You can recommend that. Okay. Summary. Again, check with your school's template or conclusion sometimes. Not all schools require it. Some schools let you stop after recommendations for the research. So just double check. And if you need to have a summary or a conclusion, it's just like a standard conclusion. But in this case, you want to recap major points from your chapter. But since this is the conclusion of the whole study, you want to leave your reader with what's important, what you think is the most important points about your study that you want them to remember. Okay, like a take-home message. And this is our contact information. Everyone will get a copy of the slides and the presentation, the audio component. This is contact information if you think you would like to make an appointment for consulting, just to see what we offer, just to see if it's right for you. And let me go back because I have on my checklist here something I want to talk about that I didn't. And that is the theoretical framework or the theory that you used. People have asked me in the past, you relate in the discussion section, you relate your findings to the findings of previous research. Do I need to bring in my theory? Do I need to bring in my theoretical framework? Yes, ideally you do. You should bring in your theory into your discussion. You can weave it into your discussion section with previous research, or you can have a separate section, something like links to theory or something like that. But at the same time, I'm kind of hesitating here because it's not always necessary. I've seen studies where chairs want you to discuss the theory, and it's kind of required. And I've seen studies where discussion of your findings in relation to previous research is enough, that you didn't need to bring in your theory into the discussion. So I've seen it both ways. So my advice is, ideally, if it works and it seems to help explain your findings, then yeah, go ahead and do it. If it seems to be a problem or it's not working well, I would just leave it out. And if somebody wants you to add it, you can add it in. But that's one of those things where it's kind of a judgment call on your part and on the part of your committee. Okay, do we have questions? I know if some people had questions that I think were answered in the course of the presentation. Anybody have any questions? I don't see any in the chat box or the question and answer box. Okay, I'll leave that information up there for a minute longer. Yeah, remember everybody is getting a copy of the slides and the presentation. Okay, no questions? All right, well, thank you for attending. And we run these, let me see, before we hear somebody. Okay, would a chapter 5 with capstone project then have a summary also, or leave the reader with a take-home message? It depends. If you look at your school's template, if it requires a summary or a conclusion, add it. If it doesn't, you don't need to. It's hard to say generally. Follow your school's guidelines. If they don't have guidelines about it, adding a summary can never hurt. There's nothing wrong with adding it. So I would say if you have no guidelines, just err on the side of caution and add a conclusion with a take-home message. And if you don't, and you hand it in and they want one, they'll just tell you. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, thank you everybody for coming, and let us know if you need to talk about consulting, if we can help you. And remember, we run webinars every week on different topics, on methodology and non-methodology related topics. So check in with us and see what we're doing on that week. And everyone have a good day, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.